There are moments in life that change everything in an instant. Moments that draw a line between who you were and who you become. For me, that moment happened on a Sunday afternoon in late September, when the autumn leaves were just starting to turn golden, and the air had that crisp quality that makes you think of new beginnings. I was sitting at table 7 at the Riverside Manor, a beautiful venue overlooking the Hudson River in upstate New York, watching my stepmother-to-be, Victoria, glide down the aisle in her ivory gown. The ceremony was picture perfect, like something out of a bridal magazine, with roses everywhere and string lights twinkling overhead. I was 17 years old, a senior at Meadowbrook High School, and I should have been happy for my father. Really, I should have. But something felt wrong that day. Something I couldn't quite name, like a shadow lurking at the edges of all that carefully orchestrated beauty. The reception had just started, and I was sitting there with my younger sister Emma, who was 14 and wearing a pale blue bridesmaid dress that she kept complaining made her look like a cupcake. We were at a table with some distant cousins we barely knew, kids who looked as uncomfortable as we felt in their formal clothes. The DJ was playing something upbeat, and people were starting to move toward the dance floor. I reached for what I thought was a regular cracker from the appetizer tray, one of those fancy ones with herbs and sea salt that they always serve at these kinds of events. I took a bite without really thinking about it, my mind elsewhere. Probably on the calculus homework I'd left unfinished or the college applications that were piling up on my desk at home. Then I tasted it, that unmistakable flavor that made my stomach drop like a stone, and I knew immediately what had happened. There were crushed peanuts mixed into the cracker, tiny pieces that I could feel on my tongue, and my whole body went into immediate panic mode. I'm severely allergic to peanuts, have been since I was 5 years old when I had my first reaction at a birthday party. My mother, God rest her soul, had been so careful after that, reading every label, calling restaurants ahead of time, making sure everyone around me knew about my allergy. She died when I was 9 years old from the same kind of allergic reaction I was about to have, because she accidentally ate something at a work event and her EpiPen was in her car and she couldn't get to it in time. For years, Victoria, she had the moment I turned her eyes, she looked, oh, this is Victoria. You're such a talented little actress, she said, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. Your father warned me you might try something like this. You faked being sick when he was dating Jennifer, and you pretended to faint when he proposed to me last Christmas. I'm not falling for it this time, sweetheart. My chest was starting to feel tight now. That scary sensation like someone was sitting on my ribs, and I could feel my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. Blood started dripping from my nose, which happens sometimes with my allergic reactions because my blood pressure spikes so high, and I saw Victoria's expression change from smug satisfaction to something like disgust. Really, Addison? She said, her voice sharp now. You're going to bleed on my wedding dress? How convenient that you're having this little episode right when everyone's looking at me. Emma was crying now, trying to push past Victoria to get to my purse where I kept a backup EpiPen. But Victoria's brother Marcus, a stocky guy in his mid-30s who worked as some kind of personal trainer, grabbed Emma by the shoulders and held her in place. Your sister needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around her, he said in this condescending tone that made me want to scream. She's fine. She's just throwing a tantrum because she's not the center of attention. I looked around desperately for my father, spotting him across the room talking to some of Victoria's relatives, laughing at something someone had said. Dad, I tried to yell, but my voice came out as barely more than a whisper because my throat was closing up. I waved my arms, trying to get his attention, but he glanced at me and then looked away, like he couldn't be bothered with whatever disruption I was causing. That moment, when my own father turned his back on me while I was literally dying, felt like a knife to the heart. It was worse than the physical pain, worse than the terror of not being able to breathe. It was the moment I realized that Victoria had somehow convinced him that I was a liar, a manipulator, a problem child who needed to be put in her place. My little cousin Tyler, who was only 10 years old and sitting at the kids' table with his siblings, started screaming for help. His mother, my Aunt Patricia, tried to quiet him down, but he kept yelling, louder and louder, that someone was dying and needed help. Other kids joined in, their high-pitched voices cutting through the music and conversation, creating this chaotic chorus that echoed through the ballroom. Victoria's face turned red with rage, and she started shouting at the parents to control their children, that this was her wedding, and she wouldn't let it be ruined by some spoiled teenager's cry for attention. The wedding photographer actually stopped taking pictures and started looking around nervously, clearly uncertain about what was happening. I tried to stand up, thinking maybe I could make it to my father's car myself, but my legs gave out and I crumpled to the floor. The room started spinning, and I could see faces above me, some concerned, some angry, some just confused. Victoria's mother, a sharp-faced woman in her 60s wearing too much jewelry, leaned down and said something about how young people today will do anything for views on social media, how her generation never would have been so disrespectful. Through my fading vision, I could see Emma fighting against Marcus, scratching and kicking and screaming, trying to get to my purse on the gift table across the room. Madison, Victoria's daughter, stood up from her table and said something to her mother that I couldn't hear. But Victoria whipped around and pointed at her, clearly threatening something, and Madison sat back down with tears streaming down her face. I had maybe 3 minutes left before my airway would close completely, maybe less. The medical bracelet on my wrist, the one that said severe peanut allergy in bright red letters, felt like a sick joke. What good was a warning bracelet when the people around you refused to believe you were in danger? I started crawling across the floor toward the kitchen, thinking maybe I could reach the panic button that restaurants and event venues are required to have for emergencies. Every breath was agony now, like trying to suck air through a coffee stirrer, and black spots were dancing in front of my eyes. Victoria's heels clicked on the hardwood floor as she followed me, her voice dripping with mockery. "Look at her," she announced to the room. "Look at how far she'll go for attention. Someone should film this so we can all remember what a little liar she is." But then I remembered something she'd said to me a week before the wedding, during what she called a bonding lunch that was really just an opportunity for her to threaten me. She'd told me that if I caused any problems at her wedding, if I did anything to embarrass her or my father, she would make one phone call to Immigration and Customs Enforcement about Uncle Miguel. My uncle, who had raised Emma and me with so much love after our mother died, who worked 2 jobs to help pay for our school clothes and field trips and birthday parties, who tucked us in every night and helped with homework and showed up to every parent-teacher conference, wasn't documented. He'd come to this country 20 years ago from El Salvador, fleeing violence and poverty, and had been living here ever since, building a life, becoming part of our community, paying his taxes through an individual taxpayer identification number, doing everything right except for that one piece of paper he couldn't get. Victoria had somehow found out about his immigration status, probably from my father during some pillow talk conversation, and she'd made it clear that my uncle's freedom depended on my good behavior. So even as I was dying on that ballroom floor, even as my lungs were failing and my heart was racing and my vision was tunneling, part of my brain was screaming that I couldn't reach that panic button because it would bring the authorities and Victoria would follow through on her threat and Uncle Miguel would be taken away from us. The cruelty of that choice, having to decide between my own life and my uncle's freedom, still makes me sick when I think about it. But survival instinct is powerful, stronger than fear or loyalty or love, and my hand reached out anyway, fumbling for the red emergency button mounted on the wall by the kitchen entrance. Victoria must have realized what I was doing because she lunged forward and grabbed my hair, yanking my head back so hard I saw stars. "You take one more step toward that button," she hissed in my ear, low enough that no one else could hear. "And I make that call tonight. One phone call and Miguel is gone. Do you understand me? Your precious uncle will be on a plane back to El Salvador before sunrise, and it will be all your fault." I froze, my hand inches from the button, my body shutting down, my mind racing through impossible calculations. Could I live with myself if Uncle Miguel got deported because of me? Could Emma and I survive without him? Would my father even care, now that he had Victoria and her perfect life and her mansion in Westchester County? But then Tyler broke free from his mother and ran straight at Victoria, this tiny 10-year-old boy crashing into a full-grown woman in a wedding dress. And the impact was enough to make her let go of my hair. In that split second of freedom, I slammed my fist against the emergency button as hard as I could, and the fire alarm started shrieking through the building. The sprinkler system activated immediately, raining water down on all 200 wedding guests, soaking the flower arrangements and the 3-tier cake and Victoria's designer wedding dress. People started screaming and running for the exits, and Victoria stood there in the middle of it all, mascara running down her face, screaming that I had destroyed her wedding, that I had ruined everything, that she would make me pay for this for the rest of my life. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was Victoria's face above me, twisted with such pure hatred that it didn't even look human anymore, and then everything went dark and quiet and peaceful. When I woke up 3 days later in the intensive care unit at Albany Medical Center, there were tubes in my throat and arms and monitors beeping all around me, and a nurse adjusting something on my IV pole. My father was sitting in a chair in the corner, scrolling through his phone, and when he saw I was awake, he didn't smile or rush over to hug me or show any sign of relief. He just said, in this tired, irritated voice, that I'd really done it this time, that I'd embarrassed him in front of everyone he knew, that Victoria was pressing charges for assault and destruction of property, that her nose was broken where I'd headbutted her, that the venue was suing for water damage to their historic building. Not once did he ask if I was okay. Not once did he acknowledge that I'd almost died. Not once did he apologize for turning his back on me when I begged for help. The doctors told me later that the paramedics had arrived within 4 minutes of the fire alarm going off, which was incredibly lucky because the venue was only 2 blocks from the fire station. But even with that fast response, I'd been without oxygen for long enough that they'd had to perform an emergency tracheotomy in the ambulance, cutting a hole in my throat so I could breathe. The scar would be permanent, they said, a thick red line across the base of my neck that would fade to silver over time but never completely disappear. I would carry the mark of that day on my body forever, a reminder of the moment my father chose his new wife over his daughter's life. Emma was there when I woke up, curled up in a chair that was too small for sleeping, her face puffy from crying. When she saw my eyes open, she burst into fresh tears and tried to climb onto the hospital bed with me, but a nurse stopped her and explained that I was too fragile for that right now, that I needed to stay still and let my body heal. Emma told me everything that had happened after I passed out, how the paramedics had to use the defibrillator to restart my heart, how they'd rushed me to the hospital with sirens blaring, how my father had refused to ride in the ambulance with me because he needed to stay and calm Victoria down. But the worst part, the thing that made my heart feel like it was breaking all over again, was what Emma told me about Uncle Miguel. Victoria had made good on her threat. While I was unconscious in the ambulance fighting for my life, Victoria had called Immigration and Customs Enforcement and told them everything she knew about my uncle's immigration status. Icy had shown up at our apartment that same night, just as Miguel was getting back from the hospital after making sure I was stable, and they'd arrested him right there in our living room. Emma had watched through her bedroom door as they put handcuffs on the man who'd raised us, who'd been more of a parent to us than our own father had been in years. They'd taken him to a detention center 2 hours north, in a facility that didn't allow minor children to visit without a parent present, and my father was refusing to take Emma to see him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. The way Victoria had weaponized Miguel's undocumented status, not just as a threat, but as punishment for my refusal to die quietly in a corner where I wouldn't embarrass her. A woman came to see me on my second day in the hospital. A kind-faced social worker named Rebecca Martinez, who worked for the hospital's Child Protective Services Department. She pulled a chair close to my bed and explained in gentle terms that the hospital was required by law to report cases where a child nearly died from medical neglect, especially when there was evidence that adults had actively prevented the child from receiving life-saving treatment. She asked me to tell her everything I remembered about the wedding, and I did. My voice still hoarse from the intubation, my throat burning with every word. I told her about eating the cracker, about begging for my EpiPen, about Victoria and her family blocking me and Emma from getting help, about the threat regarding Miguel, about my father turning his back on me. Rebecca wrote everything down in her neat handwriting, asking clarifying questions here and there, never interrupting or making me feel like I was exaggerating or lying. The next morning, a detective showed up with a recording device and asked me to go through my story again. Detective Sarah Williams was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked. She told me that the fire alarm had automatically triggered a 911 call with a recorded timestamp, and that the paramedics had documented my condition upon arrival as full anaphylactic shock with imminent respiratory failure. She showed me photographs from the wedding on her tablet, asking me to identify which of Victoria's family members had physically prevented Emma from reaching my medication, which adults had blocked other children from helping me. I pointed out Victoria's brother Marcus, who'd held Emma back, and Victoria's mother Caroline, who'd grabbed Tyler when he tried to help. Detective Williams wrote down their names and showed me statements from venue staff who'd witnessed the whole thing, including a server who'd heard Victoria say she wouldn't let me ruin her wedding, and a photographer who'd captured the moment I collapsed on the floor. When the detective asked about Uncle Miguel, I told her about Victoria's threat, and she sat back in her chair with this grim expression on her face. She explained that threatening to report someone's immigration status while in the process of committing assault was actually a federal crime, a form of witness intimidation that could add years to Victoria's sentence if she was convicted. She asked if Victoria had threatened Miguel at any other time, and I told her about the lunch the week before the wedding, about how Victoria had made it clear that my uncle's freedom depended on my silence. Detective Williams took detailed notes about that conversation too, asking me to remember exactly what Victoria had said, what restaurant we'd been in, whether anyone else had heard. The investigation was expanding beyond just the wedding day assault, and I could see that Victoria had made a terrible mistake by threatening Miguel in front of witnesses, and then following through on that threat immediately after being arrested. My father called the hospital room that afternoon, and I made the mistake of answering because I thought maybe, just maybe, he was calling to apologize or to check on me or to acknowledge what had happened. Instead, he launched into this tirade about medical bills and insurance investigations and how I'd ruined his relationship with Victoria's family and destroyed his reputation at work. He worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Manhattan, and apparently some of Victoria's relatives were connected to important clients, and now those business relationships were in jeopardy because of what I'd done. He never mentioned the fact that I'd almost died. He never asked about the scar on my throat or the nightmares I was having or how I was coping with what had happened. He just kept saying I was selfish and manipulative and attention-seeking, exactly like my mother had been before she died. That last part, comparing me to my dead mother in that contemptuous tone, was what made me hang up on him. I unplugged the phone from the wall and asked the nurse to remove it from my room entirely. Rebecca came back that evening with information about discharge planning and where Emma and I would go when I was released from the hospital. She explained in her calm, professional voice that going back to my father's house probably wasn't safe given what had happened and his ongoing denial of the severity of the situation. Child Protective Services needed to approve any placement, but Tyler's parents, my aunt and uncle on my mother's side, had already called offering to take us in temporarily. They had a spare bedroom in their house in Saratoga Springs, which was in the same school district as Meadowbrook High, so Emma and I wouldn't have to change schools or lose our friends. Rebecca thought it was the best option given the circumstances, and honestly, I was just relieved to know we wouldn't have to go back to that house where my father had chosen Victoria over us so completely. Aunt Patricia and Uncle James had two boys of their own, Tyler, who'd tried to help me at the wedding, and his older brother Connor, who was 15. But they'd always made it clear we were part of their family too. The hospital physical therapist came to my room the next day with a bag full of training EpiPens, the kind that don't have needles but work mechanically the same way. She sat down with Emma and me and made us practice over and over, holding the device with the orange tip pointed down, swinging it firmly into the outer thigh, holding it in place for a full 10 seconds while the medication injected. We practiced on foam blocks designed for training, and the therapist didn't let us stop until we could do it perfectly, without hesitation, without having to think about the steps. She explained that hesitation kills people with severe allergies, that every second counts when your throat is closing, that we needed the muscle memory to be automatic in an emergency. She gave me 2 real EpiPens to carry with me at all times, one in my purse and one in my school backpack, and explained that the school would need to keep several more stored in different locations around the building. I would never be more than a minute away from an EpiPen ever again, she said firmly, and I could hear in her voice that she was thinking about all the people who hadn't been that lucky, who'd died because they couldn't reach their medication in time. A public defender named Grace Chen showed up on my 3rd day in the hospital, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and wearing a no-nonsense expression that I found oddly comforting. She explained that she'd been assigned to represent Emma and me in the various legal proceedings that were starting, both the criminal case against Victoria and the custody issues with our father, and the dependency court proceedings with CPS. Her first instruction was clear and non-negotiable. Do not post anything online about what happened. Not on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or anywhere else. Anything I wrote could be screenshotted and used against us in court, could be twisted by Victoria's lawyers to make me look unstable or vengeful, or like I was trying to influence public opinion. Instead, Grace gave me a composition notebook and told me to write down everything I remembered privately, with dates and times and as much detail as possible, while the memories were still fresh. She explained that memories fade and change over time, that what feels crystal clear today might be fuzzy in 6 months when we finally got to trial, and that having contemporaneous notes would be invaluable. I spent that whole afternoon filling the notebook with memories, starting from the moment I bit into that cracker and going all the way through waking up in the ICU. I wrote about the crushing pressure in my chest, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, the way Victoria's face had looked when she grabbed my hair, the sound of Tyler screaming for help, the feel of the emergency button under my palm. Grace came back that evening and took photographs of my neck bandages and the bruises on my arms where people had grabbed me trying to stop me from getting help. She documented everything with her phone camera, including the medical chart that showed exactly how close I'd come to death, the paramedic reports that described the emergency tracheotomy, the police report from the scene. Evidence, she explained, was everything in cases like this because Victoria's lawyers would try to argue that I'd exaggerated or fabricated the whole thing, and we needed to be able to prove every single detail. Then Rebecca showed up with another woman, a sharp-eyed immigration attorney named Patricia Delgado, who'd been contacted about Miguel's case. Patricia sat down and explained in careful terms that IC detention was complicated and often took months or even years to resolve. We'd need to gather documents showing that Miguel was a productive member of the community, that he had strong ties here, that he'd been taking care of us responsibly since our mother died. We'd need letters from his employers, from our teachers and neighbors, from anyone who could speak to his character and his importance to our family. The bond hearing would happen within a few weeks, and the amount would probably be high, maybe $50,000 or $60,000, which might as well have been $1 million for all the chance we had of raising it. Patricia warned us that we needed to start thinking about fundraising, about asking the community for help, because bond money was the only way to get Miguel out of detention while his case worked its way through the immigration courts. Before I was discharged from the hospital, a CPS investigator came to take my official statement, a stern woman in her 50s who'd probably heard every excuse and lie imaginable in her career. She recorded our conversation and made me swear to tell the truth. And then she asked me to describe what happened at the wedding in excruciating detail. I told her everything, and she listened without expression, occasionally asking me to clarify a point or describe exactly what someone had said. When I finished, she told me that multiple wedding guests had already confirmed seeing adults physically prevent children from helping me during a medical emergency, that several people had heard Victoria's comments about not letting me ruin her day, that the paramedic's statement made it clear I would have died without emergency intervention. The investigator said that criminal charges were likely and that things were going to get more complicated with my father before they got better. I just nodded, too exhausted to care about what my father thought or felt anymore. Aunt Patricia showed up at the hospital the next morning, driving her silver minivan, with pillows and blankets piled in the back and this determined expression on her face that made me want to cry with relief. She helped me gather my things while Emma packed our clothes and personal items into plastic hospital bags, and then she wheeled me out to the parking lot in a wheelchair because hospital policy required it even though I could walk. The 40-minute drive to their house in Saratoga Springs was agonizing, every bump in the road sending jolts of pain through my neck where they'd cut me open. Aunt Patricia kept apologizing for the rough ride, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Uncle James followed behind us in his truck with more of our belongings. When we pulled up to their house, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a basketball hoop in the driveway, Tyler and Connor were waiting on the front porch with a welcome home sign they'd made from poster board and markers. They'd cleared out the guest room and set up 2 twin beds with matching purple comforters that smelled like fabric softener and home. Aunt Patricia took me on a tour of the kitchen, showing me where she'd put special stickers on anything that contained peanuts or was manufactured in a facility that processed tree nuts. She'd bought 3 different types of protein shakes and throat lozenges since I could barely swallow solid food yet, and she'd rearranged her pantry to create a completely nut-free section just for me. That first dinner with them, I tried to eat mashed potatoes, but it felt like swallowing broken glass, so I ended up drinking one of those nutrition shakes that tasted like chalk but at least didn't hurt going down. The bathroom mirror showed me the angry red line across my throat for the first time without bandages, and I stood there staring at it for maybe 10 minutes, tracing it with my finger, wondering how long it would take before I could look at it without thinking of my mother's funeral, without remembering how she'd looked in her casket with makeup covering the similar scar on her own throat. Patricia Delgado came to Aunt Patricia's house 3 days after I was discharged, her arms full of folders and legal documents about immigration law. She sat at the kitchen table and explained the realities of ICE detention, showing us statistics about bond amounts and deportation rates, and the percentage of cases that ended with people being sent back to their home countries. Miguel's case would be difficult, she warned us, because he'd been in the country for 2 decades without documentation, and while he had no criminal record and had been working and paying taxes the whole time, immigration judges were under pressure to deport as many people as possible. We needed character letters, she explained, from everyone who knew him, letters that specifically described his role in our family and his contributions to the community. The filing fees alone would be thousands of dollars before we even got to the bond hearing, and Patricia estimated we'd need at least $25,000 in cash to have any hope of getting him released while his case was pending. Detective Williams called while I was doing the breathing exercises the physical therapist had taught me to help my throat heal. She asked if I had contact information for the other kids who'd been at the wedding, the ones who'd witnessed what happened. I told her I'd need to call their parents first to explain what she needed, because I didn't feel comfortable just handing over children's phone numbers without permission. She understood and gave me her direct line to call back when I had consent from the parents. I spent the next hour calling families I barely knew, explaining what had happened at the wedding in clinical terms that didn't quite capture the terror of it, asking if their children could speak to a detective about what they'd seen. Most of the parents said yes immediately, some of them angry on my behalf, some of them shocked that they hadn't realized how serious the situation had been while it was happening. A few admitted they'd thought I was faking at first, too, because Victoria had been so convincing in her certainty that I was lying for attention. My father texted that evening, saying he wanted to meet with Emma and me, but only if we came alone without any social workers or lawyers present. I screenshot the text immediately and forwarded it to Rebecca, who called 10 minutes later, sounding alarmed. She was very clear. Absolutely do not meet him without supervision, given what had happened at the wedding and his ongoing refusal to acknowledge the danger we'd been in. If he really wanted to see us, she explained, he could request supervised visits through the proper channels with CPS, but unsupervised contact was not happening. I texted back a simple no, and then blocked his number because I couldn't handle any more of his manipulation and guilt trips. Emma saw me do it and started crying. Not because she disagreed, but because blocking our own father's number felt like admitting that we didn't have a family anymore, that we were orphans in every way that mattered, even though he was still alive. The school district sent someone to Aunt Patricia's house with a laptop and textbooks so I could keep up with my classes while recovering. A home instruction teacher named Mr. Davidson came 3 times a week and sat at the dining room table helping me work through calculus problems and chemistry equations while Emma was at her regular middle school classes. It was strange doing school without the background noise of other students, without the bells ringing between periods, or the social dynamics of who sat with whom at lunch. Mr. Davidson was patient and kind, never pushing me too hard on days when my throat hurt too much to talk, letting me type out answers instead of speaking them aloud. He brought worksheets and assignments from my actual teachers, including notes from my AP English teacher saying she was thinking of me and that we'd work together to make sure I didn't fall behind with college applications. Tyler showed me his phone one evening about a week after I'd been discharged, and my stomach dropped when I saw what he wanted to show me. Victoria's Instagram account was full of professional wedding photos, beautifully edited pictures that somehow managed to crop out all the chaos and drama. Her caption talked about having the perfect day, despite some people trying to ruin it with fake emergencies for attention, just like they'd done at other family events in the past. Her sister and cousins were commenting things like, "Some people are so narcissistic they can't stand to see others happy, and teenagers today will do anything for social media clout." My hands shook as I scrolled through hundreds of comments from people who hadn't been there. People who believed Victoria's version of events because she told it so convincingly, with just enough truth mixed in to make the lies believable. I wanted to respond, wanted to defend myself, wanted to post the hospital photos and the medical records, and scream at all these strangers that I'd almost died while she stood there refusing to help. But Grace, the school counselor, set up a video call on Aunt Patricia's laptop that week to check on my mental health and to start planning my return to school. Mrs. Rodriguez, the plan, the truth, but admit the message he wrote, reading my mother, 3 days she'd been, but the timestamp at the bottom of the video matched exactly with the time the 911 call had gone through, according to what the paramedics had told me. Tyler helped me save the video in 3 different places: my email, his cloud storage, and a thumb drive that Aunt Patricia kept in her desk drawer, because we both understood that evidence had a way of disappearing when wealthy people like Victoria were involved in legal proceedings. The next morning, I took the bus downtown to the county courthouse and filled out a public records request form for the 911 call audio and all the dispatch records from that night. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass window told me it would take 2 to 3 weeks to process, unless I wanted to pay an extra fee for expedited service, which I did using money from my savings account that I'd been putting aside for college. Having official documentation from government sources felt like building a fortress brick by brick, creating a wall of evidence between Victoria's lies and what had actually happened. That afternoon, the venue manager called my cell phone, and I knew before he even started talking what he was going to say. The security camera footage from the wedding had been automatically erased after 7 days, he explained, because their system was set to record over old footage continuously to save storage space. He sounded apologetic, but not particularly surprised, and I wondered if someone from Victoria's family had called to confirm the footage was gone before he contacted me. 2 days after that disappointing news, a different CPS social worker showed up at Aunt Patricia's house to interview Emma separately about what she'd witnessed at the wedding. Aunt Patricia took me out to the backyard while they talked in the living room, and I spent that entire hour pacing back and forth on the grass, worried that Emma would get confused or scared and mess up her statement somehow. But when the social worker came outside afterward, she told me that Emma had done great, that her account was clear and consistent and matched what the other witnesses had described. She said Emma's testimony would be helpful for their investigation and that they were building a strong case for why returning to our father's house wouldn't be safe for either of us. That evening, Patricia Delgado called to say she'd filed the bond request for Miguel with the immigration court, but we needed those character letters as soon as possible to support the motion. And Patricia helped me make a list of everyone we could ask: Miguel's employers from both his jobs, our teachers and school counselors, neighbors who'd known him for years, the priest from our church, people from the community center where Miguel volunteered on weekends. We spent hours calling people and explaining what we needed, what information the letters should include, how important this was for getting Miguel out of detention. Most people said yes immediately because Miguel was beloved in our community, known for his kindness and hard work and the sacrifices he'd made to raise two girls who weren't even biologically his children after their mother died. By the end of the week, I had commitments for 23 letters from people across all parts of Miguel's life, each one describing specific examples of his good character and his importance to our family. While Emma did her homework at the kitchen table one evening, I sat in the guest room typing out my statement about what Victoria had said to me while I was dying on that ballroom floor. My fingers kept freezing over the keyboard when I got to the part where she'd called my mother weak and pathetic for dying and leaving us behind, where she'd mocked the idea that anyone could love us enough to care if we lived or died. I had to stop 3 times to wipe my eyes and do the breathing exercises the therapist had taught me because the rage that bubbled up made my chest feel tight and painful. But I forced myself to write every single word she'd said, including the specific threat about calling Ace on Miguel, because this statement might be the only proof we had of what really happened in those final moments before I lost consciousness. The statement ended up being 4 pages long, single-spaced, with every detail I could remember about the timeline and who did what and who said what. Late that night, after everyone else in the house was asleep, I opened Instagram on Aunt Patricia's laptop and typed out a message to Madison asking if she was okay and saying I understood if she couldn't talk to me right now given everything with her mother. I kept it short and didn't mention anything about testifying or the case because I didn't want to pressure her or get her in trouble with Victoria. The app showed she read the message within 5 minutes, but she didn't reply, and I understood completely because being stuck between your parent and the truth is probably one of the worst positions a teenager can be in. I closed the laptop and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if Madison was lying in her own bed at that expensive boarding school doing the same thing, wondering if she felt as alone as I did. A week later, we all had to go to the courthouse for Victoria's criminal arraignment, where she would enter her plea to the charges. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Richardson, who worked for the district attorney's office, had warned me that Victoria would almost certainly plead not guilty and would probably be released on bail since she had no criminal record and strong ties to the community. But hearing her actually say those words, standing there in her designer navy suit with her lawyer beside her, made my stomach turn with anger and frustration. The judge set conditions for her release, including absolutely no contact with Emma or me, a minimum distance of 500 feet between us at all times, and a prohibition on any communication, direct or indirect. Watching her walk out of the courtroom with her lawyer afterward, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor, felt like watching a predator slip back into the shadows to wait for another opportunity to strike. My father was there too, sitting on Victoria's side of the courtroom like he was her family instead of ours. When we walked past him in the hallway afterward, Emma reached out to touch his arm, some desperate child part of her still hoping he'd turn around and be our dad again. But he pulled away like she'd burned him and walked faster to catch up with Victoria's family, all of whom were glaring at us like we were criminals who'd falsely accused an innocent woman. The rejection hit Emma hard, and I watched her face crumple as she realized he'd chosen his wife over his daughters in the most public way possible. Detective Williams caught up with us in the parking lot and asked for permission to pull my phone records from the night of the wedding to verify the timeline of events and my attempts to get help. She had a consent form ready on her tablet, and I signed it right there because I had absolutely nothing to hide and everything to gain from showing what had really happened that night. 3 days after the arraignment, Rebecca called to tell me that CPS had completed their home visit to my father and Victoria's house. She read me parts of the report over the phone while I sat at Aunt Patricia's kitchen table, my hands gripping my glass of water so hard my knuckles went white. The social worker had noted how my father kept looking at Victoria before answering any questions, how Victoria interrupted constantly to speak for him, how they'd removed all photos of Emma and me from the common areas and replaced them with framed pictures from the wedding. The report used phrases like concerning power dynamics and controlling behaviors and inability to prioritize children's safety, which made me feel less crazy about everything that had happened. It wasn't just me being difficult or dramatic. It was a trained professional observing the same disturbing patterns I'd been seeing for months. That night around 11 o'clock, when everyone was asleep and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, my phone buzzed with a message from Madison on Instagram. I clicked on it expecting text, but found a voice recording file attached with just 3 words typed underneath. I'm so sorry. My hands shook as I grabbed my earbuds from the nightstand and pressed play on the recording, turning the volume down low so I wouldn't wake Emma in the bed across the room. Madison's voice came through first, barely a whisper, saying she was recording this secretly and that she hoped it would help. Then, I heard Victoria in the background, clearly on a phone call with someone, her voice loud and confident. She was laughing about how she'd threatened to call ICE on my illegal uncle while I was dying on her wedding day, and how smart she'd been to use that threat to keep me in line. The recording was only 43 seconds long, but it had everything. Victoria saying my name, saying Miguel's name, describing exactly what she'd done and why she'd done it. I played it 5 times in a row, each time feeling my heart pound harder as I realized this was actual concrete proof of what she'd done, evidence that couldn't be explained away or spun into something else. My first instinct was to post it everywhere online, to tag every news outlet and social media account I could think of, to make sure everyone knew the truth about Victoria and what she'd done. I even opened Twitter and started typing a post, my thumbs flying over the keyboard. But then I remembered what Grace had said about not posting anything that could compromise the case, about how one impulsive social media post could give Victoria's lawyers ammunition to get evidence thrown out or claim I was trying to taint the jury pool. I deleted the draft tweet and instead forwarded the recording to Detective Williams' email with a short message explaining what it was and how I'd gotten it. She replied within an hour, even though it was almost midnight, saying she'd received it and would add it to the evidence file immediately. The next week, Mrs. Rodriguez called to schedule a meeting about my return to classes. She explained that word had spread around school about what had happened at the wedding, and some parents were asking questions about allergy protocols and safety measures. She showed me during our video call some anonymous comments from the school's parent Facebook group where people were calling me dramatic and attention-seeking, echoing Victoria's lies almost word for word. We spent an hour planning strategies for dealing with rumors and sideways looks, and Mrs. Rodriguez gave me scripts for how to respond to questions from classmates without getting drawn into arguments or having to relive my trauma over and over. She also arranged for me to enter and exit through the office instead of the main doors to avoid the crowds and the inevitable staring that would happen when people saw the scar on my throat. That same week, Patricia Delgado called with news that Miguel's ICE bond hearing had been scheduled for the following month. She warned us that the judge would probably set the bond really high, maybe $50,000 or more, because that's what immigration judges typically did for people who'd been in the country for a long time without documentation. She said we should start thinking seriously about fundraising, maybe setting up a GoFundMe page or organizing events in the community to raise money. The idea of asking strangers for money made me feel sick with shame. But Patricia explained that it was the only realistic way to get Miguel out of detention before his case went to trial, which could take years. I spent that entire weekend going door to door in our old neighborhood collecting the character letters for Miguel, talking to people who'd known him for years and watching their faces when I explained why we needed their help. His boss at the construction company, a gruff man named Frank, who'd employed Miguel for 8 years, wrote about how Miguel never missed a day of work and always volunteered for the hardest jobs. Our neighbor Mrs. Chen wrote about how Miguel had fixed her fence for free when her husband was in the hospital, how he'd shoveled her driveway every winter without being asked. My AP English teacher wrote about how Miguel came to every parent-teacher conference armed with detailed questions about my education and Emma's, how he'd learned English at night classes so he could help us with homework. The priest from our church wrote about Miguel volunteering at the food bank every Saturday morning without fail for over a decade, organizing donations and helping distribute food to families in need. By Sunday night, I had 23 letters in a folder that I delivered to Patricia's office Monday morning, each one a testament to the kind of man Miguel was and the kind of guardian he'd been to us. The cease and desist letter from Victoria's lawyer arrived by certified mail on Tuesday while I was doing calculus homework at the kitchen table. Aunt Patricia had to sign for it, and she handed it to me with worry all over her face, asking if everything was okay. The letter was 3 pages of dense legal language that basically threatened to sue me for defamation if I kept telling people what had really happened at the wedding. It used phrases like false allegations and malicious intent and substantial financial damages, making it sound like I was some kind of criminal for telling the truth about almost dying. I took a photo of every page and sent them to Grace, who texted back immediately telling me to ignore it completely, that it was just an intimidation tactic that lawyers used when they knew their client was guilty and didn't have any real defense. 2 days later, Rebecca called with news that actually made me smile for the first time in weeks. CPS had made a preliminary finding of medical neglect and emotional abuse regarding my father's actions during my allergic reaction and his subsequent behavior. She read me the key parts of the finding, words about how he'd failed to provide necessary medical care when it was clearly needed, how he'd ignored obvious signs of a life-threatening emergency, how he'd prioritized his relationship with his spouse over his responsibility to his children. The finding meant that my father would have to complete a service plan before he could have unsupervised contact with us again. A plan that would include parenting classes and anger management and individual therapy. Within an hour of Rebecca hanging up, my father was calling her office repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails that she played for me later. He kept saying the findings were wrong, that I'd manipulated everyone, that CPS had overstepped their authority. But Rebecca stood by the report and told him the findings were final pending his appeal. The morning of Miguel's bond hearing arrived faster than I expected, and we all got up at 5 in the morning to make the 2-hour drive to the federal courthouse in the city. The courtroom was intimidating and cold, with armed guards everywhere and a judge who barely looked at us during the proceedings. Patricia presented all our letters and argued passionately that Miguel wasn't a flight risk, that he had strong ties to the community and 2 children depending on him. But the prosecutor from ICE kept talking about enforcement priorities and public safety and the importance of following immigration law. The judge set the bond at $75,000 and denied our request for release on his own recognizance or ankle monitoring as an alternative. When he banged his gavel saying Miguel would remain detained pending his immigration hearing, Emma ran out of the courtroom sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. I found her in the bathroom throwing up from crying, and I held her hair back while she kept saying, it wasn't fair, over and over until her voice gave out. 3 days after that devastating hearing, we had to go back to court for the temporary protection order proceeding against Victoria. The courtroom was smaller this time, less intimidating, but somehow more intimate in a way that made me nervous. Victoria sat on the other side with her lawyer, looking polished and put together in another expensive suit, her face carefully arranged into an expression of patient suffering. When my turn came to testify, I had to stand at a podium facing the judge and tell the whole story again from the beginning. My voice shook and I had to stop twice to drink water, because talking for that long still hurt my throat, but I got through the entire narrative, including the threat about Miguel. The judge asked me specific questions about the timeline, about exactly what Victoria had said, about which of her family members had physically prevented me from getting help. I answered as clearly and honestly as I could, keeping my eyes on the judge instead of looking at Victoria because I knew if I looked at her, I might start crying or screaming or both. When I finished testifying, the judge granted the protection order for 6 months and specifically warned Victoria about witness tampering. She had to stay at least 500 feet away from Emma and me at all times, couldn't contact us directly or through third parties, couldn't post about us on social media. If she violated the order in any way, she'd be arrested immediately. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like maybe the legal system was taking this seriously. Like maybe adults in positions of authority actually believed me and were trying to protect us. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Addison, honey, we need to talk about this misunderstanding. Please call me back. Dad." I stared at it for several seconds before taking a screenshot and forwarding it straight to Detective Williams with a note about the protection order violation, because apparently my father thought he could just ignore court orders that were inconvenient for him. I didn't respond to him at all, just blocked that number too and went back to my homework. 2 weeks passed before I felt ready to try going back to school part-time. Aunt Patricia drove me there early Monday morning and walked me into the office to make sure all my medical paperwork was in order and that the staff understood my 504 plan. The principal, Dr. Jameson, assured us that every teacher had been briefed about my allergy needs and that EpiPens were now stored in 3 different locations: the nurse's office, the main office, and the athletic department. I only had to attend morning classes for now, with the option to stay longer if I felt okay physically and emotionally. Everything went fine through first and second period, my teachers welcoming me back quietly without making a big deal of it. But when I walked into the cafeteria for break, the smell hit me like a physical wall: peanut butter. Someone 3 tables away had a peanut butter sandwich, and even though I knew intellectually that the smell couldn't hurt me, my body went into immediate panic mode. My chest got tight, my hands started shaking, and I couldn't catch my breath even though I knew I hadn't eaten anything dangerous. The room started spinning, and I grabbed the nearest table to steady myself, which made everyone turn and stare at me with curiosity or concern or pity. It took 20 minutes before I could breathe normally again, and another 10 before I stopped shaking enough to stand up. The nurse called Aunt Patricia to pick me up early, and I felt so stupid and weak for not being able to handle a smell, for letting Victoria win even when she wasn't anywhere near me. The next day, we had the 504 plan meeting in the school conference room with Dr. Jameson, the school nurse, the district coordinator for special education, and 2 of my teachers. They went through every single detail of my allergy protocol, making sure everyone understood the signs of anaphylaxis and exactly how to use an EpiPen. The nurse demonstrated with a practice pen and made each person at the table show they could do it correctly. They designated a peanut-free table in the cafeteria with signs posted nearby, and the district coordinator said they'd send an email to all parents, reminding them about severe allergies and asking them to avoid sending peanut products in their children's lunches when possible. Having all these safety measures in place made me feel less anxious about being at school, though I still got nervous every time I walked past the cafeteria and wondered if today would be the day I'd have another panic attack. That afternoon, Detective Williams called with what she described as very good news. The tech people had analyzed the audio recording Madison sent me and verified it was authentic and unedited, with timestamps that matched perfectly with the 911 dispatch logs from the wedding. The recording clearly captured Victoria threatening Miguel while I was having the allergic reaction, and combined with all the witness statements and medical evidence, they had a very strong case. She sounded genuinely optimistic, which gave me hope that Victoria might actually face real consequences for what she'd done, instead of just getting a slap on the wrist like wealthy people so often do. 3 days later, Patricia drove Emma and me to the ICE detention center to try visiting Miguel. We'd filled out all the paperwork weeks ago and submitted it online, but when we got to the front desk, the officer looked at his computer screen and shook his head. We weren't on the approved visitor list yet, he explained, and the application was still being processed somewhere in the bureaucratic maze. When I asked how long it would take, he said anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months depending on the backlog, that we needed to register online first and wait for approval and then schedule visits in advance. I felt so stupid for not understanding how the system worked, for getting Emma's hopes up about seeing Miguel, when we should have known it wouldn't be that simple. She cried the whole 2-hour drive back, and I couldn't even comfort her properly because I was trying not to cry too, trying to stay strong for her sake, even though I felt like screaming at the unfairness of it all. The next morning, Rebecca called with better news. CPS had officially approved our kinship placement with Aunt Patricia and Uncle James for at least 6 months with the possibility of extension if needed. They'd completed the home study and background checks, and everything had come back clean. Aunt Patricia and Uncle James had already told us we could stay as long as we needed, but having it official from the state made it feel more real and permanent. When I told Emma, she started crying again, but this time from relief instead of grief. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from Madison. She said her mother's lawyer had been asking her questions about the wedding and preparing her for possible testimony, and she was terrified. She wrote that she might have to testify if she got subpoenaed, but she was scared of what her mother would do to her if she told the truth on the stand. I texted back that I understood completely, that she should do whatever she needed to do to keep herself safe, that she'd already helped more than she knew by sending me that recording. I told her not to put herself in danger for my sake, that I could survive this with or without her testimony. She sent back a heart emoji and then went silent, and I wondered if Victoria had come into the room or if Madison had just run out of courage to keep talking. The school counselor scheduled my first real therapy appointment for Thursday afternoon with a psychologist who specialized in trauma. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was in a medical building downtown, decorated with calming blue walls and those inspirational posters about strength and resilience that always feel kind of hollow when you're actually going through something terrible. I sat in her waiting room for 10 minutes before I could make myself go in when she called my name. She asked me to tell her about the wedding, and I tried, but I kept having to stop and drink water from the bottle she offered. When she asked about my mother dying the same way I almost died, I completely broke down, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. I hadn't really cried about my mother in years, had kept all that grief locked away in some deep place where it couldn't hurt me. But sitting there trying to explain how it felt to almost die exactly like she did made everything come flooding back all at once. Dr. Chen just sat there and let me cry without trying to make me stop or tell me everything would be okay. She said we'd take things slow, that there was no rush to process everything at once, that healing from trauma was a marathon and not a sprint. It was harder than I expected to be that vulnerable with someone I barely knew, but there was something about her patient silence that made it feel safe to fall apart. 2 days later, Amanda Richardson, the prosecutor on Victoria's case, filed a motion about witness intimidation that included copies of the cease and desist letter and my father's texts trying to contact me. She asked the judge for stricter bail conditions, including a curfew and a prohibition on any contact with witnesses, even through third parties. The judge granted the motion, and Victoria now had to be home by 9 every night with electronic monitoring to verify her location. Meanwhile, Patricia was working on a bond redetermination motion for Miguel, gathering even more letters and documentation to show he deserved a lower bond amount. She'd collected letters from 15 more people in the community, including our pastor and 3 of Miguel's coworkers and his supervisor from the construction company. She also had documentation showing he'd been in the country for 12 years without any arrests or even traffic tickets, proving he was a productive member of society who just happened to lack the right paperwork. She seemed cautiously optimistic that we could get the bond reduced to something we could actually afford through community fundraising. The next morning, Rebecca called with news about my father and the CPS case. She explained that if he wanted to see Emma again, he'd have to complete a service plan that included parenting classes, anger management sessions, and individual counseling to address why he'd let me almost die at his own wedding. All visits would have to be supervised by a court-approved monitor at a special facility downtown, at least until he completed the plan and demonstrated that he could prioritize our safety over Victoria's feelings. 3 days later, Amanda called to tell me the preliminary hearing was set for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning. She wanted to meet with me that afternoon to practice my testimony. So Aunt Patricia drove me to the courthouse where we spent 2 hours in a small windowless conference room, going over every possible question Victoria's lawyer might ask. Amanda made me describe the wedding over and over, asking the same questions in different ways until I could answer without my voice shaking or tears starting. She showed me diagrams of the courtroom and explained where I'd sit, how to address the judge, what to do if I didn't understand a question. We practiced breathing exercises for when I felt panic rising, and she had me tell the story maybe 20 times until the words came out steady and clear, even though my hands still shook under the table where no one could see them. That night, I sat at Aunt Patricia's kitchen table trying to write my victim impact statement on her laptop. The first draft was 3 pages of pure rage about how Victoria deserved to rot in prison forever, how she'd destroyed our family, how I hoped she lost everything she cared about. Aunt Patricia read it over my shoulder and gently suggested I might want to revise it since the judge would see it and might not respond well to what she called my understandable anger. I deleted the revenge fantasies and rewrote it, focusing on how scared I'd been, how the scar on my throat reminded me every single day of almost dying, how Emma still had nightmares about losing me the way we'd lost our mother. The final version was only 1 page, but Amanda said it was powerful and would definitely make an impact on the judge. 2 days before the hearing, my father called Aunt Patricia's house phone at dinner time. Uncle James answered and reluctantly handed the phone to me with a worried look on his face. My father started with this weak apology about how things had gotten out of hand at the wedding, like it was some minor misunderstanding instead of attempted murder by neglect. But before I could even respond, he switched tactics and started demanding I tell everyone I'd been exaggerating about what happened, that I needed to recant my lies about Victoria trying to hurt me. He said she was actually a good person who just got stressed on her wedding day, that I was destroying his life with my drama and manipulation. My hands shook as I held the phone, but I managed to say no in a clear, firm voice before hanging up on him. Aunt Patricia immediately called Amanda to report the contact violation, while I sat at the table trying to stop shaking, angry at myself for still caring what he thought. That same evening, Madison texted from yet another new number I didn't recognize. She wrote that her mother's lawyer had been pressuring her about what she'd say if she had to testify, but she wasn't going to lie if they called her to the stand. She said she'd tell the truth about making the recording and what she'd witnessed at the wedding, even though she was terrified of what her mother would do when she found out Madison had betrayed her. She wrote that seeing me almost die had changed something fundamental in her, that she couldn't pretend it didn't happen just to keep the peace. I texted back that she was brave and that I respected her for doing the right thing even when it was hard, that I understood how difficult it must be to choose between her mother and the truth. She didn't respond after that, and I hoped it meant she was okay and not that Victoria had found out about our conversation. Thursday morning arrived too fast, and suddenly I was sitting in the courtroom wearing the only semi-formal outfit Aunt Patricia had been able to find that would cover my throat scar. A navy blue sweater with a high neck that made me feel like I was being strangled. The room smelled like old wood and industrial floor cleaner, and the judge's bench looked huge and imposing from where I sat next to Amanda at the prosecutor's table. Victoria and her lawyer sat across the aisle, and she was wearing a conservative gray pantsuit with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, looking nothing like the screaming bride who'd stood over me while I died. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone stood as Judge Martinez entered, an older woman with short silver hair and a no-nonsense expression. She started reading through the charges, and each one made my stomach clench tighter. Reckless endangerment, assault, witness tampering, making criminal threats. When the paramedic took the stand to testify, I felt my whole body tense up. He described in clinical terms finding me unconscious with my airway almost completely closed, explaining that I was minutes away from brain damage or death when their ambulance arrived. He walked the court through the emergency tracheotomy they'd performed right there on the venue floor because my throat was too swollen for normal intubation, describing how he'd had to cut through skin and tissue while his partner prepared the oxygen. He said in his 22 years as a paramedic, he'd rarely seen someone so close to death from anaphylaxis who'd survived, that another 5 minutes and the outcome would have been very different. Listening to him describe my near death from a medical perspective made me relive those final moments before I'd passed out, and I used the breathing exercises Amanda had taught me to keep from having a full-blown panic attack right there in the courtroom. After the paramedic stepped down, Amanda called Madison to the stand. She looked absolutely terrified walking up there in her school uniform, keeping her eyes on the floor instead of looking at her mother. Amanda asked her about the recording, and Madison confirmed in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask her to speak up that she'd made it on her phone during a conversation she'd overheard after the wedding. Amanda played it for the court, and everyone heard Victoria's voice crystal clear saying she'd threatened to call ICE on my illegal uncle while I was dying on the floor, laughing about how clever she'd been. The judge's face changed completely when she heard those words, her expression shifting from neutral professionalism to something harder and more judgmental. Even Victoria's lawyer looked uncomfortable, shuffling his papers and whispering urgently to his client, who sat there with her arms crossed, looking defiant. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent for a long moment before the judge asked Madison if that was definitely her mother's voice on the recording. Madison said yes and started crying, and the judge asked if she needed a break, but Madison shook her head and said she wanted to finish. After all the testimony was heard, the judge didn't hesitate to extend the no-contact order for the maximum time allowed by law. She warned Victoria in a stern voice that any attempt at witness tampering would result in immediate incarceration without bail, and she added even stricter conditions, including electronic monitoring that would track her location 24 hours a day, and a curfew requiring her to be home from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. She said the evidence presented showed clear and ongoing danger to minor children, and that the court would not tolerate any violations of these conditions whatsoever. The bond redetermination hearing for Miguel happened the following week at the immigration court downtown. Patricia had gathered 37 support letters from people across our community, plus documentation showing Miguel had been in the country for 12 years, had 2 jobs, paid taxes through an ITIN, had no criminal record, and was the sole caretaker of 2 minor children who were U.S. citizens. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s, reviewed all the materials while we sat in the gallery barely breathing. After nearly an hour of arguments from both Patricia and the ICE prosecutor, the judge announced he was reducing the bond from $75,000 to $15,000. It was still an enormous amount of money, more than we'd ever had at one time, but suddenly it felt possible to raise instead of completely hopeless. Patricia started making phone calls right there in the courthouse hallway, reaching out to community organizations and churches and advocacy groups. Within 3 days, our church had raised $8,000 through donations and fundraising events like bake sales and car washes. Uncle James and Aunt Patricia took out a personal loan for $5,000 against their house, an incredible sacrifice that made me cry when I found out. Miguel's boss at the construction company put up $2,000 from his own savings because he said Miguel was the best employee he'd ever had and worth every penny. The community came together in ways I'd never imagined possible, with people who barely knew us contributing whatever they could, $5 here, $20 there, until we reached the full amount. A week later, I stood outside the detention center with Emma and Patricia and Aunt Patricia, waiting for Miguel to walk out through those heavy metal doors. When they finally opened and he emerged wearing an ankle monitor but smiling that warm smile I'd missed so much, Emma ran straight into his arms and they both started sobbing while I stood there trying to keep myself together. Back at Aunt Patricia's house that night, Miguel sat us down on the couch and pulled us both into a long, tight hug. His ankle monitor pressed against my leg through his jeans, a reminder that he wasn't really free, just temporarily released pending deportation proceedings. He smelled like the detention center soap instead of his usual cologne, and his eyes looked tired and older, but he was here and that's what mattered. Mijas, he said quietly in that serious tone he used when something was really important. I need you both to promise me something. We nodded against his shoulders. No revenge, he continued. No tricks, nothing illegal against that woman or your father. His hands gripped our shoulders as he looked at each of us in turn. We do this the right way, through the courts and the lawyers, you understand? I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that the legal system was rigged and slow and sometimes didn't deliver justice, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He'd just spent weeks locked up because of Victoria's vindictive phone call to ICE, and here he was telling us to trust the system anyway. The next morning, Amanda called while I was eating breakfast. She explained that Victoria's lawyer had rejected every plea deal they'd offered, which meant we were definitely going to trial. It would probably be months of waiting and preparation and stress, she warned, but at least everything would come out in court and a jury would hear the full truth. I wrote down all the important dates she gave me on the calendar Aunt Patricia kept on the refrigerator. Jury selection, pretrial motions, the trial itself. 3 days later, Rebecca showed up with more paperwork for Aunt Patricia and Uncle James to sign, making our kinship placement official for 6 months with options to extend as needed. She also confirmed that my father would only get supervised visits with Emma if and when he completed his parenting classes and anger management program, and even then only at the CPS office downtown with a professional monitor present. School started feeling more manageable after a few weeks of half-days. The 504 plan was working well, with EpiPens stationed in multiple locations and all the staff trained on recognition and response. Walking through the halls, knowing there was emergency medication within reach at all times, made my anxiety decrease noticeably. Dr. Chen's office became a safe space where I could talk about the complicated feelings I had toward my father, the anger and grief and confusion all tangled together. She gave me homework assignments like writing letters I'd never send and making lists of things that helped me feel calm when I started to panic. 2 weeks passed before Emma finally slept through an entire night without waking up screaming about the wedding. I lay in my bed watching her breathe steadily with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, hardly daring to move in case I disturbed her fragile peace. I started recording video journals on my phone, sitting in the bathroom with the door locked and whispering the whole story into the camera. Talking to the lens felt easier than talking to Dr. Chen somehow, like I could be completely honest without worrying about being judged or misunderstood. By the end of my calendar, we had lawyers working for us, social workers protecting us, a community supporting us, and a legal system that was slowly, painfully slowly moving toward justice. We were safe at Aunt Patricia and Uncle James's house. We had people who loved us and believed us, and we were going to get through this together, even if it took years to finish, even if the road ahead was long and uncertain. Every day I touched the scar on my throat and remembered that I'd survived, that I was stronger than Victoria ever gave me credit for, that I'd fought for my life and won. And that knowledge, that certainty of my own resilience, was something no one could ever take away from me, no matter what happened in the courtrooms and hearings that lay ahead. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least now we were telling it our way, with truth as our foundation and love as our strength. And that had to count for something in this complicated, messy, beautiful world.